this is week 14 of the fashion in the long 19th century. The very end, and one short subject I decided to mention to you, namely playing with clothes. Clothes for all kinds of dressing up games, and in the 19th century, among the rich sections of the society, this was something very popular and fashionable. You have different forms of entertainments and balls involving dressing up. And this is something that nowadays is mostly popular among children, and in the 19th century this was mostly a grown-up game, because you needed quite a lot of money if you wanted to look your best at a fancy dress party. Of course, there are some children involved sometimes, but they were not the main focus of this fashion. And let's look at some examples. So, as I said, playing with clothes, dressing up was part of Victorian culture, and especially in the second half of the 19th century, this becomes really visible because of the developments in photography. We have many examples of photographs made for private people to commemorate their costumes and the time they had during those fancy dress balls. We also have some professional photographers playing with those conventions for artistic effect. And definitely the artist I would like you to remember here is one of the pioneering women in the art of photography, Julia Margaret Cameron. You may want to Google her. This is just one example of what she did in her art, because she basically treated photography as a kind of painterly medium. So she tried to take photographs that would resemble paintings, historical paintings, for example. So we have models dressed up in some costumes. Here probably were resembling some sort of fantasy medieval thing, because this is one of the photographs showing the legend of King Arthur. So the knight laid down in the boat with these women around him is supposed to be King Arthur. These were not friends and family, these were actually models hired by the artist and dressed by her in some fancy clothes, and she was quite popular, she was quite successful as a photographer. So you may find quite a lot of examples of her art online. She would be probably the most interesting and innovative artist to use photography in this way and to make artistic photography with dressing up. But this becomes quite a popular thing in the second half of the 19th century. Sometimes we have the allegorical scenes, like here, this is some sort of commercial photograph showing what looks like to be an angel and a devil bargaining perhaps for a soul, or trying to influence a man who himself looks quite historically dressed in some sort of 18th century costume, but the angel and the devil are clearly, of course, theatrical. Another popular thing in the the second half of the 19th century, so when photography became a popular hobby for the rich, is the practice of the so-called tableau vivant. Tableau vivant meaning a living picture, a living painting. This was a leisure activity, a game, very popular in the 19th century, in which the participants of a ball or a special evening would dress up as some historical characters or a scene from, I don't know, classical painting, mythology, classical literature, and they would pose as if for a painting for a while. Of course, when photography allowed it, the culmination of this game would be to take a photograph together, to have the photograph taken together. So we have quite a lot of surviving Victorian pictures showing people dressed up and posing as if for a fancy portrait, something that the Pre-Raphaelites would do. So to have a real sitter, a portrait of a real model, but dressed up as some sort of character from history, mythology, whatever. So here we have a lady dressed up probably as Cleopatra or some other ancient queen. This sometimes involved children. Here we have photograph from the Royal Collection showing the children of Queen Victoria dressed up and posing for a tableau vivant. I don't really know what it's supposed to depict. Is it some sort of legend? Hard to say. There is an old man and there is this saintly or royal looking female character on a pedestal, and there is another one wrapped up in some clothing looking like some, I don't know, hero, legendary hero, Hercules, whatever. Whatever that was, here we have the children of Queen Victoria dressed up and posing for a photograph to commemorate probably some sort of tableau vivant or some sort of amateur theatrical production they did for the Queen and Prince Albert. This was something that was popular, and if you remember that Victorian families were often very numerous and there were lots of children, this was something that some families, rich families, practiced more or less regularly. So we have that. You'll have a little more later on. But another way to use costumes to dress up was fancy dress balls, and this was something that was popular. Also in the past for the royalty, for the aristocracy. Sometimes they might involve masking their faces, so they would be masquerades. They are still very popular in the 19th century, and they could be private or they could be organized, for example, in beautiful, very often new, opera houses in the cities. So the opera house would not only serve as a theater, but also as a place to hold one or more annual balls, masked balls, mostly in the winter, in the carnival season. This was something that was part of the Christian holiday year, let's say. And in some places, like in Venice, it went for centuries. In the 19th century, with the growing middle class, with the growing wealth of the society, everybody wanted to join in and not having to travel to Venice. Some of the novels set in the 19th century, like Gaston Leroux's The Phantom of the Opera, they feature a ball, a masked ball at the Opera House, and this was something that did happen regularly in the late 18th century, in late 19th century, and then at the turn of the 20th century. So we start having fashion plates with some suggestions of costumes for fancy dress balls. So if masking was involved, it would normally be for part of the evening. So if it was, let's say, a New Year's Eve ball, then at 12 o'clock everybody would unmask and recognize their friends. Or any ball, they would unmask in the end and recognize their friends. Of course, the point was, of course, to allow flirtation with strangers. So if everybody was masked, you didn't have to be properly introduced to somebody to ask them to dance or to join in some sort of party games or something, or even to approach and talk. So it allowed for this kind of more discreet flirtation without having to observe all the social norms. The fashion plates I found didn't really show the masks. They show costumes, so not all the balls involved masking in this kind of traditional Venetian way. Sometimes they would have a special theme, so everybody, especially private balls, they might have a theme, so everybody would dress according to the general theme of the ball. But big public balls usually had a jumble of different costumes that still might fall into a few categories. So historicizing costumes inspired by historical fashions, folk costumes, so costumes inspired by traditional costumes from all kinds of rural and exotic locations, and literary and mythological and costumes, so you dress as a particular character from culture. So this might include, heroines of Shakespeare plays, or some legendary characters, or classical gods and goddesses, and so on and so forth. So there would be cultural references, folk references, and historical references. And here we have a few fashion plates. The first one is from the Romantic period, so probably the 30s. And you can see three different suggestions. The one in the middle might be some sort of cultural reference to some heroine of a fashionable novel or theater play, or someone. It looks contemporary enough, but probably it alludes to something I cannot really decipher. If you know, tell me. The costume on the right is clearly inspired by history, showing some sort of stylized medieval dress with a long veil headdress. Normally, as you can see, these costumes would follow to some extent the current fashions, but adapted to be recognizable as a fancy dress costume, and to reveal the inspiration. It would be a historical character. It would be a lady from a portrait, perhaps. So something like that. And the costume on the left hand side here is evidently inspired by some folk costume. Looks European, hard to say. Maybe Swiss, maybe German, maybe Italian, or from any other location. What is interesting, why the folk costumes were so popular, is the length of the skirt. Look how short it is. This is just below the knee. You wouldn't see this kind of costume anywhere except perhaps for the ballet dancer on the stage, or if it was kind of fossilized or solidified as a folk costume, this might be acceptable. So if a lady wanted to show her figure, and especially her beautiful shapely legs, she might choose a folk costume because of the short dress, the short skirt. Then we have a Victorian, kind of mid-Victorian fashion plate showing two suggestions for costumes for costumes for a fancy dress party. It's really hard to say. I don't see the date here, whether it's just before the crinoline frame or early in the fashion for the crinoline frame. Anyway, we have two dresses with short skirts, relatively short skirts, not as short as this folk costume, but revealing much of the ankle, and also I guess one of them is some sort of legendary character with those stars, so she's supposed perhaps to be some allegory of the Northern Star, or something like that. It's captioned. It's captioned l'étoile, a star, so it's kind of allegory. The other one is captioned a ruby, because it's mainly in this rich ruby color. Yeah, that's the cat. That's the cat. So they might refer to something recognizable, or just be used to emphasize the beauty and elegance and good figure. Of course, these ladies definitely wear corsets of the wearer. The last fashion plate in this section is from the 70s by the look of it. So after the crinoline went out of fashion, and we have two women dressed up in some sort of historicizing clothes, something that would show, let's say, the inspiration from the 18th century, or perhaps earlier in the history, of course adapted to the tastes of the 1870s. So the shape, especially the shape of the skirt with the train, is more or less, the cat is going crazy, is more or less modern. You should see him, really. Perhaps I'll go and get him. No. There is a child accompanying one of the women, and he's dressed like a little page boy, which could also be popular, especially if the ball was private. Normally the women would not take small children to public balls. That's the culprit. Say hello, Watson. This is Watson. That's the culprit. That's the one who was going crazy. And here we have the two women and a boy. Children, if they were shown to the guests during the fancy dress balls, would very quickly leave the company and spend time mostly with the servants before being put to bed. So yeah, I think we continue in a moment. I'll have Watson pacified.